For 3 years, Dr. John Watson believed Sherlock Holmes was dead. He believed Professor Moriarty had taken him over the edge of the Reichenbach Falls, ending the life of the greatest detective he had ever known. But in the spring of 1894, a strange murder shook London. A young aristocrat was found shot to death inside a locked room. There was no weapon, no clear motive, no sign that anyone had entered or escaped, and no one nearby had even heard the shot. It was exactly the kind of impossible case Sherlock Holmes would have loved. Watson could only imagine what his old friend might have discovered. But as he searched for answers on his own, he crossed paths with a strange, elderly book collector, a meeting that seemed completely unimportant at the time. Watson had no idea that within hours, everything he believed about the last 3 years would be turned upside down. Before we begin, subscribe to Midnight Archives and tell us your theory in the comments as the clues unfold. Can you solve the mystery before the truth is revealed? And more importantly, are you ready to discover what really happened to Sherlock Holmes at the Reichenbach Falls? This is Arthur Conan Doyle's The Adventure of the Empty House, Part 1. It was the spring of 1894, and all of London was fascinated by the murder of the Honorable Ronald Adair. The circumstances of his death were so unusual and so difficult to explain that the case quickly became one of the city's great mysteries. The public learned most of what came out during the police investigation, but some important details were kept secret. Years later, I was finally allowed to reveal the missing pieces that completed the remarkable story. The murder itself was fascinating, but what followed affected me far more deeply. Even after all these years, I can still remember the rush of joy, shock, and disbelief that overwhelmed me. I had kept these events private because I had been personally forbidden to reveal them. Only recently was that restriction finally removed. My close friendship with Sherlock Holmes gave me a lasting interest in crime. After his disappearance, I continued to follow unusual cases in the newspapers, and more than once I tried, for my own satisfaction, to use Holmes's methods to solve them. I cannot say I was particularly successful. No case interested me more than the death of Ronald Adair. As I studied the evidence presented at the official investigation, which concluded that he had been murdered by an unknown person or persons, I felt the loss of Sherlock Holmes more strongly than ever. There were details in the case that I knew would have caught his attention immediately. I could imagine his trained eye finding meaning where the police saw only confusion. I spent the entire day thinking about the case, but no explanation seemed to fit all the facts, so I began by reviewing everything that was publicly known about Ronald Adair and the strange circumstances surrounding his death. Ronald Adair was the second son of the Earl of Maynooth, who was serving at the time as governor of an Australian colony. His mother had returned from Australia for cataract surgery, and she was living with Ronald and his sister Hilda at 427 Park Lane in London. Ronald belonged to the highest levels of society. As far as anyone knew, he had no enemies and no serious bad habits. He had been engaged to Miss Edith Woodley of Carstairs, but they had ended their engagement by mutual agreement several months earlier. There was no indication that either of them had been deeply hurt by the separation. Other than that, Ronald lived a quiet and conventional life. He was not known as an emotional or reckless man. Nothing in his life suggested that he was in danger. Yet, sometime between 10 o'clock and 11:20 on the night of March 30th, 1894, death came for him in an extraordinary and completely unexpected way. Ronald was very fond of playing cards. He played often, but never for amounts large enough to cause him financial trouble. He belonged to 3 card clubs, the Baldwin, the Cavendish, and the Bagatelle. On the day of his death, Ronald played whist at the Bagatelle Club during the afternoon and again after dinner. That evening, the other players at his table were Mr. Murray, Sir John Hardy, and Colonel Moran. Their statements showed nothing unusual about the game. Ronald may have lost about £5, but no more than that, and with his considerable fortune, such a loss meant very little. In fact, Ronald was generally a careful player and usually came away with winnings. Investigators learned that several weeks earlier, he and Colonel Moran had won as much as £420 in a single session from Godfrey Milner and Lord Balmoral. At exactly 10 o'clock on the night of his murder, Ronald returned home from the club. His mother and sister were spending the evening with a relative, so they were not there when he arrived. A servant heard Ronald enter the front room on the second floor, the room he normally used as his private sitting room. She had already lit a fire there, but because smoke had been coming into the room, she had opened the window. After Ronald entered, no unusual sound was heard. At 11:20, Lady Maynooth and her daughter returned home. Lady Maynooth went to say goodnight to her son, but when she tried the door, she discovered that it was locked from the inside. She knocked and called to him. There was no answer. Eventually, help was called and the door was forced open. Ronald Adair was lying near the table, dead. A powerful revolver bullet had struck him in the head and caused a terrible wound. Death must have been immediate. But there was no gun anywhere in the room. On the table were two 10-pound banknotes, along with £17 and 10 shillings in silver and gold. The money had been carefully arranged into small piles of different amounts. Nearby was a sheet of paper containing numbers and the names of several men from Ronald's card clubs. Investigators believed that shortly before his death, he had been calculating how much he had won or lost while playing cards. A careful examination of the room only made the mystery more confusing. No one could explain why Ronald had locked the door from the inside. It was possible that the killer had locked it and then escaped through the open window, but the window was at least 20 feet above the ground. Directly beneath it was a flower bed filled with blooming crocuses. Neither the flowers nor the soil had been disturbed. There were no footprints or other marks on the narrow strip of grass between the house and the street. It seemed impossible that anyone had escaped that way. Perhaps Ronald himself had locked the door, but if that was true, how had the killer reached him? There was nothing outside the window that could help someone climb up, and if the killer had fired from the street through the open window, the shot would have required extraordinary accuracy. There was another problem. Park Lane was a busy street. A cab stand was less than 100 yards from the house, yet no one had heard a gunshot. And still, there could be no doubt that Ronald had been shot. The bullet had expanded when it struck him, causing the fatal wound. So there was the mystery. Ronald Adair was dead inside a room locked from within. There was no weapon in the room, no signs that anyone had entered or escaped through the window. No one had heard the shot. Nothing had been stolen, and investigators could find no clear motive because Ronald was not known to have any enemies. I spent the entire day trying to find some theory that could explain all these facts at once. Holmes had often taught me that an investigation should begin by finding the explanation that required the fewest unnecessary assumptions, but I confess that I made very little progress. That evening, I walked across the park and arrived near the Oxford Street end of Park Lane at around 6 o'clock. A small group of people had gathered on the sidewalk, all staring toward one particular window. Their attention immediately showed me which house I had come to see. Among the crowd stood a tall, thin man wearing tinted glasses. I suspected that he might be a detective working in plain clothes. He was explaining his own theory about the murder, while the others gathered around him and listened. I moved closer, hoping to hear something useful, but his explanation seemed ridiculous to me. Disappointed, I stepped away. As I turned, I accidentally bumped into an elderly man standing behind me. Several books fell from his arms and scattered onto the sidewalk. I immediately bent down to help him pick them up. One of the books was titled The Origin of Tree Worship. From that strange title and the number of books he carried, I assumed the old man was a collector, or perhaps a dealer in rare and unusual volumes. I apologized for the accident, but the books were clearly very precious to him. He responded with an angry expression, gathered them together, and disappeared into the crowd. I remember his bent back and white sideburns as he moved away. I returned my attention to 427 Park Lane, but seeing the house in person did nothing to solve the mystery. A low wall and railing separated the property from the street, so getting into the garden would have been easy. Reaching the window, however, seemed impossible. There was no drain pipe or anything else that even an athletic man could have used to climb up. More confused than before, I returned home to Kensington. I had been in my study for less than 5 minutes when my maid came in and told me that someone wanted to see me. To my surprise, the visitor was the same elderly book collector I had accidentally knocked into near Park Lane. His thin, wrinkled face was surrounded by white hair, and he carried at least a dozen old books under his arm. "You're surprised to see me, sir," he said in a rough, croaking voice. I admitted that I was. The old man explained that he had a conscience. After seeing me enter the house, he had decided to follow and apologize for his rude behavior earlier. He wanted me to know that he had meant no harm and that he appreciated me helping him pick up his books. I told him he was making far too much of a minor accident. Then I asked how he knew who I was. He explained that he owned a small bookshop nearby at the corner of Church Street. Then he began showing me some of the books he carried, including British Birds, Catullus, and The Holy War. Every one of them, he assured me, was a bargain. Then he looked toward the bookshelf behind me and remarked that 5 more volumes would perfectly fill an empty space on my second shelf. The gap made the shelf look untidy, he said. I turned my head to look at it. When I turned back, the elderly bookseller was gone. Sherlock Holmes was standing on the other side of my study table, smiling at me. I jumped to my feet and stared at him. For several seconds, I could not speak. Then a gray mist seemed to fill my vision, and for the first and last time in my life, I fainted. When I regained consciousness, my collar had been loosened, and I could still taste brandy on my lips. Holmes was leaning over my chair with a flask in his hand. In that familiar voice I believed I would never hear again, he apologized. He told me he had not expected his sudden appearance to affect me so strongly. I grabbed him by both arms. "Holmes, is it really you? Can you actually be alive? Did you somehow escape from that terrible abyss?" Holmes asked me to give myself a moment. His dramatic return, he admitted, had given me a serious shock. I told him I was fine, though I could hardly believe my own eyes. I gripped his sleeve again and felt the thin, strong arm beneath it. At least I knew he was no ghost. The joy I felt at seeing him again was impossible to put into words. I asked him to sit down and explain how he had survived the Reichenbach Falls. Holmes sat across from me and lit a cigarette in the same calm, casual manner I remembered so well. He was still wearing the worn coat of the old bookseller, but the white hair and the rest of his disguise now lay on the table. He looked thinner and sharper than before. His face was unusually pale, and it was clear that the years since I had last seen him had not been easy ones. Holmes admitted that he was glad to stand at his full height again. For a tall man, he said, pretending to be a foot shorter for several hours was no easy task. Then his tone became serious. He told me that if I was willing to help him, we had a difficult and dangerous night ahead of us. Perhaps, he suggested, it would be better to explain everything after that work was finished. I could not agree. After believing him dead for 3 years, my curiosity was overwhelming. I wanted the truth immediately. Holmes asked me whether I would come with him that night. I told him I would go whenever and wherever he wanted. It felt exactly like the old days. We had enough time for a quick dinner before we needed to leave, so Holmes finally agreed to explain what had happened at Reichenbach. He began with a statement that left me completely stunned. He had never fallen into the Reichenbach Falls. The note he had left for me had been completely genuine. Holmes had known that Professor Moriarty was following him along the narrow path that led toward the falls. When he saw Moriarty approaching, he believed there was a very real chance that his career and his life were about to end. Holmes saw the determination in Moriarty's eyes. After exchanging a few words, he asked for permission to write the short note that I later found. Moriarty allowed him to do so. Holmes left the note with his cigarette case and walking stick, then continued along the narrow path with Moriarty following close behind. At the end of the path, Holmes had nowhere else to go. Moriarty carried no weapon. Instead, he rushed at Holmes and wrapped his long arms around him. He knew his criminal empire had been destroyed, and his only remaining goal was revenge. The two men struggled at the very edge of the falls. Holmes, however, knew Baritsu, a Japanese system of wrestling that had proven useful to him more than once. He managed to slip free from Moriarty's grip. Moriarty lost his balance. For several seconds, he kicked desperately and clawed at the air, trying to recover. He could not. Holmes watched him fall, strike the rocks far below, bounce away from them, and disappear into the water. I listened in complete amazement, but one detail immediately troubled me. I had seen the tracks myself. 2 sets of footprints had gone down the path toward the falls, and none had returned. Holmes explained that this was exactly what had happened. The moment Moriarty disappeared, Holmes realized that fate had given him an extraordinary opportunity. Moriarty was not the only man who wanted him dead. At least 3 other dangerous men had sworn revenge against him, and Moriarty's death would only make their hatred stronger. If those men knew Holmes was alive, they would continue hunting him. But if the entire world believed Sherlock Holmes was dead, those enemies would eventually become careless. They would expose themselves. Holmes could then destroy what remained of Moriarty's organization and reveal that he was still alive only when the danger had passed. He had formed the entire plan within moments of Moriarty's fall. The problem was leaving the scene without creating another set of footprints. Holmes examined the rock wall behind him. It appeared almost completely vertical, but not quite. There were a few small places where he could put his feet, and the suggestion of a narrow ledge above. Climbing the entire cliff was impossible. Walking back along the wet path would leave footprints and destroy the illusion that he had fallen. Holmes even considered putting his boots backward, a trick he had used before, but 3 sets of tracks pointing in the same direction would have made the deception obvious. So he chose the rock wall. The climb was extremely dangerous. The falls thundered below him. More than once, grass tore loose in his hands, or his foot slipped from the wet rock. One mistake would have sent him into the abyss. Eventually, Holmes reached a ledge several feet deep and covered in soft green moss. There he could lie completely hidden. From that ledge, he watched me and the others arrive and investigate what we believed was the scene of his death. Holmes later told me, with his familiar dry humor, that we had examined the circumstances with great sympathy and very little efficiency. Eventually, we left for the hotel, convinced that both Holmes and Moriarty had disappeared into the falls. Holmes believed the most dangerous part of his plan was over. Then a huge rock came crashing down from above. It struck the path and bounced into the abyss. At first, Holmes thought it might have fallen naturally. A moment later, he looked up and saw a man's head outlined against the darkening sky. Then another rock came down. This one struck the ledge where Holmes was hiding, less than a foot from his head. The truth was immediately clear. Moriarty had not been alone. A second man had been watching from a distance. He had witnessed Moriarty's death, seen Holmes escape, and waited until everyone else had left. Now he intended to finish the job. Holmes saw the man appear again above him and knew another rock was coming. There was no time to think. He began climbing back down toward the path. Going down was even more difficult than climbing up. Another rock flew past while Holmes hung from his hands from the edge of the ledge. Halfway down, he lost his grip and fell. By extraordinary luck, he landed on the path below. He was cut and bleeding, but alive. Holmes immediately ran. He covered 10 miles through the mountains in darkness, and a week later he reached Florence, certain that no one in the world knew where he had gone. Only one person was allowed to know the truth, his brother, Mycroft Holmes. Holmes needed money while he remained hidden, so he had no choice but to trust Mycroft. He apologized to me for keeping me in the dark, but he explained that it had been essential for everyone to believe he was truly dead. Several times during those 3 years, Holmes had almost written to me. Each time he stopped himself. He feared that my affection for him might cause me to reveal something without meaning to, and even the smallest mistake could expose his secret. That was also why he had turned away from me earlier that evening when I knocked the books from his arms. Holmes was in danger. If I had recognized him, even a moment of surprise on my face might have attracted the attention of someone watching him. Mycroft remained his only contact. Unfortunately, events in London had not gone as Holmes had hoped. When Moriarty's criminal organization was broken apart, 2 of its most dangerous members remained free. Both were among Holmes's most determined enemies. Holmes stayed away. For 2 years, he traveled through Tibet and spent time in Lhasa with the head lama. During that period, reports appeared about the remarkable travels of a Norwegian explorer named Sigurdsson. I had read some of those reports without ever imagining that Sigurdsson was actually Sherlock Holmes. From Tibet, Holmes traveled through Persia, visited Mecca, and made a short but interesting visit to the Khalifa at Khartoum. He later shared the results of that visit with the British Foreign Office. After returning to Europe, Holmes spent several months in southern France, where he carried out chemical research in a laboratory in Montpellier. By the time that work was finished, Holmes had learned that only one of his enemies remained in London. He was already considering his return when news reached him of the extraordinary murder at Park Lane. The death of Ronald Adair interested Holmes immediately. The mystery itself was remarkable, but Holmes also recognized that the case offered him a very unusual personal opportunity. He returned to London at once. He went to Baker Street in his own appearance, giving Mrs. Hudson such a shock that she nearly became hysterical. Thanks to Mycroft, Holmes discovered that his rooms and papers had been preserved exactly as he had left them. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, after 3 years away, Sherlock Holmes sat once again in his old chair at 221B Baker Street. He told me that there was only one thing missing. He wished he could have looked across the room and seen his old friend Watson sitting in the other chair. I listened to this extraordinary story on that April evening, still struggling to accept that the tall, thin man sitting across from me was truly Sherlock Holmes. He had somehow learned of the personal loss I had suffered during his absence, and, as always, his sympathy appeared more clearly in his manner than in his words. "Work is the best antidote to sorrow, my dear Watson," Holmes told me. Then he revealed why he had come to see me. He had work for both of us that night, and if they could bring it to a successful conclusion, Holmes believed it would be important enough to justify all the danger he had endured. I immediately asked him what we were going to do.
Holmes would tell me nothing more. "You will hear and see enough before morning," he said. We had 3 years of the past to discuss, and for the moment, Holmes said, that would have to be enough. At 9:30, Sherlock Holmes and I would leave together once again, and we would begin the remarkable adventure of the empty house. To be continued in Part 2. Sherlock Holmes had returned to London after 3 years in hiding. One of Moriarty's most dangerous men was still free. Ronald Adair had been murdered under impossible circumstances, and Holmes clearly knew far more about the case than he had told me. In Part 2, Holmes and Watson will step back into the streets of London together, where a trap is already being prepared, and one of them will become the target. Subscribe to Midnight Archives so you don't miss the conclusion of the adventure of the empty house.